The small diner at the corner of Pine and Main wasn't particularly special. Its neon sign flickered inconsistently, and the vinyl booths had seen better days. But for the people of Riverdale, it was a second home. The smell of fresh coffee and homemade pie wafted through the air as locals chatted over breakfast and lunch. Among the waitstaff was a young woman named Rose. At 26, she had already experienced more hardship than most. Raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs, Rose had learned early on about struggle and sacrifice. Now, working at the diner while taking online classes, she was determined to create a better future for herself. Every morning at exactly 6:15 a.m., Rose would arrive at the diner, tie her apron around her waist, and begin her day with a smile. Her regular customers adored her, not just for her efficiency, but for her genuine warmth. She remembered everyone's orders, their children's names, and always had an encouraging word for those who needed it. On a particularly cold Tuesday in November, as rain pounded against the windows of the diner, Rose noticed a man huddled under the awning of the closed bookstore across the street. He wore a tattered coat, his shoulders hunched against the biting wind. For 3 days straight, she had seen him in the same spot, clutching what looked like an old notebook. "He's been there for days," Rose mentioned to her coworker as she refilled the coffee pot. "I wonder if he's hungry." Her coworker shrugged. "Probably. But Mr. Chen doesn't like us serving the homeless. Says it's bad for business." Rose glanced at the man again. Something about his demeanor, the way he sat with a certain dignity despite his circumstances, touched her. When her break came, she made a decision. Packing up a container of hot soup, some toast, and a large coffee, Rose slipped out the back door of the diner. Making her way across the street, she approached the man cautiously. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I thought you might like something warm." The man looked up, surprise evident in his tired eyes. He hadn't shaved in days, and his weathered face told the story of someone who had faced significant challenges. Yet there was intelligence in those eyes, a spark that hardship hadn't extinguished. "That's very kind," he said, his voice unexpectedly articulate. "But I don't have any money to pay you." Rose shook her head. "It's on me. Everyone deserves a hot meal on a day like this." As she handed him the food, she noticed calluses on his hands, working hands that had seen labor. Not knowing what else to say, she added, "I'm Rose. I work across the street if you need anything else." "Thank you, Rose," the man replied. "My name is Thomas." The following day, Thomas was there again. And the day after that. Each time, Rose would bring him something to eat during her break. They began to talk, brief conversations at first, then longer ones. She learned that Thomas had been an engineer before a series of unfortunate events led to his current situation. First, the company he worked for had closed unexpectedly. Then, while between jobs, his mother had fallen ill, and the medical bills had drained his savings. Finally, a fire in his apartment building had left him with nothing. "It's amazing how quickly it can all fall apart," he told her one day, no self-pity in his voice, just a matter-of-fact observation. "One day you're planning for retirement, the next you're wondering where you'll sleep." What struck Rose most was that despite everything, Thomas spent his days writing in his notebook. "Ideas," he explained when she asked. "Solutions to problems. Just because I'm down doesn't mean my mind has to be." As weeks passed, Rose's simple act of kindness deepened into genuine friendship. She began bringing Thomas books from the local library, and he would share his thoughts on them during their conversations. She discovered he was brilliant, his understanding of engineering concepts and his creative approach to problems was unlike anything she had encountered. One evening, as Rose finished her shift, she found Thomas waiting outside the diner, looking different, cleaner, his clothes less rumpled, a new energy about him. "I've got something to show you," he said, excitement evident in his voice. He opened his notebook to a detailed sketch of what looked like a complicated device. It's a new type of water filtration system. More efficient, less expensive. I've been working on it for months. Rose looked at the drawing, impressed but unsure why he was showing her. It's incredible, Thomas. But I submitted it to a startup competition, he continued. And Rose. I won. Not just the competition, but funding to develop a prototype. Rose's eyes widened. Thomas, that's amazing. There's more, he said. The judges were impressed with my background in engineering and my design. One of them owns an environmental engineering firm, and he's offered me a consulting position while I develop my prototype. The transformation in Thomas over the next few months was remarkable. With the prize money, he secured temporary housing and began to rebuild his life. His water filtration system prototype showed promise, attracting interest from companies focused on environmental solutions. But even as his circumstances improved, he never forgot the kindness that had sustained him during his darkest time. 6 months after their first encounter, Thomas arrived at the diner dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks. Rose hardly recognized him as he sat down at the counter. The usual? She asked with a smile. Actually, Thomas said, sliding an envelope across the counter, I came to give you this. Inside, Rose found a check, a percentage of the initial investment Thomas had received for his filtration system, along with a handwritten note, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Your kindness didn't just feed my body, it nourished my spirit when I needed it most. Rose stared at the check, stunned. Thomas, I can't accept this. I just did what anyone would do. But that's just it, he replied gently. Not everyone would do what you did. And I want you to use this for your education. You mentioned you're taking online classes, now you can finish your degree without working yourself to exhaustion. Word of what Thomas had done spread quickly through the small town. His story, from homelessness to successful inventor, inspired many. But for Rose, the most powerful lesson wasn't about Thomas's eventual success, it was about seeing the humanity in every person, regardless of their circumstances. In the years that followed, Thomas's water filtration system would go on to provide clean water to communities around the world. And Rose, with Thomas's gift, completed her degree in social work, eventually founding a community center that offered resources and support to those experiencing homelessness. Their story became a reminder that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected sources, and that a simple act of kindness can set in motion a ripple effect that changes countless lives. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about Thomas and Rose. Engineer's journey from street to success became the talk of Riverdale, with many residents shocked to learn that the disheveled man they had walked past for months had once designed systems for major corporations. What fascinated people most wasn't just Thomas's rags-to-riches story, but the unlikely friendship that had blossomed between him and Rose. In interviews, Thomas was quick to credit Rose with saving not just his body from hunger, but his spirit from despair. When you're at your lowest, it's not just food you're lacking, he explained to the reporter who interviewed him. It's dignity. It's someone looking you in the eye and seeing a person, not a problem. Rose gave me that. The diner where Rose worked suddenly became busier than ever. Customers came from neighboring towns, hoping to be served by the waitress whose simple kindness had sparked such an extraordinary chain of events. Mr. Chen, who had once frowned upon serving the homeless, now proudly displayed the newspaper article on the wall. For Rose, the attention was uncomfortable. I didn't do anything special, she insisted whenever someone praised her. I just treated another human being with respect. But even as she downplayed her role, Rose found herself changed by her experience with Thomas. She had always been kind, but now she approached her interactions with a deeper awareness of how a small gesture could impact someone's life in ways she might never know. The check Thomas had given her remained untouched for weeks. Every time Rose considered cashing it, something held her back. It wasn't that she didn't need the money, her student loans were mounting, and her mother's health was declining, requiring more expensive care. But accepting such a large sum felt overwhelming. One evening after a long shift, Rose found Thomas waiting for her outside the diner. He had become a regular customer, but today he seemed different, more serious than usual. "You haven't cashed the check," he said, not as an accusation but as a simple statement of fact. Rose sighed. "I can't take your money, Thomas. What I did, it wasn't for a reward." Thomas smiled. "I know that. That's precisely why I want you to have it." He gestured for her to walk with him, and they strolled through the town square where the spring flowers were beginning to bloom. "When I was designing my filtration system," Thomas explained, "I kept thinking about efficiency, how to create something that would make the most impact with limited resources. And then I realized that's exactly what you did for me. Your small act of kindness had an efficiency that no engineer could design. It multiplied." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "I don't see this money as payment for soup and coffee, Rose. I see it as an investment, the same way my investors believe in my ideas. I believe in you and your dreams." As they stood there in the fading light, a group of teenagers walked by, laughing and carefree. Thomas watched them pass before continuing. "Do you know what the hardest part of being homeless was? It wasn't the cold or the hunger. It was becoming invisible. People walked by me as if I didn't exist. But not you. You saw me." His words struck Rose deeply. She had never considered that the simple act of acknowledging someone could be so powerful. The next day, Rose cashed the check. But rather than using all of it for her education as Thomas had suggested, she set aside a portion to establish a small foundation, one that would provide grants to people who, like Thomas, had the skills and ideas to rebuild their lives but lacked the resources. She named it the Visible Fund, in honor of Thomas's words about the pain of invisibility. Its mission was simple: to see potential where others saw only problems. When Thomas learned what Rose had done with part of the money, he wasn't surprised. It aligned perfectly with the person he had come to know, someone whose generosity wasn't a single action but a way of moving through the world. "Some people spend their whole lives trying to be seen," Thomas remarked when Rose showed him the foundation's website. "You spend yours making sure others are not forgotten. That's rare, Rose. Rarer than you know." As summer turned to fall, the Visible Fund awarded its first grant. The recipient was a former teacher who had lost everything in a house fire. With the money, she was able to rent a small apartment and restart her tutoring business. Within months, she was helping struggling students in the community while rebuilding her own life. Rose continued working at the diner, though now only part-time. The rest of her hours were dedicated to finishing her degree and managing the growing foundation. Applications poured in, not just from Riverdale but from neighboring towns as well. Thomas, meanwhile, had become something of a local celebrity. His water filtration system was being tested in several developing countries, showing promising results in areas where clean water was scarce. He'd been invited to speak at conferences and universities, sharing not just his technical expertise but also his personal journey. "Success isn't linear," he would tell audiences. "Sometimes the path forward looks like failure to everyone else." One rainy afternoon, nearly a year after their first encounter, Thomas and Rose sat in the same diner where it all began. The booth they occupied had been unofficially designated as their spot by the staff, who would direct curious visitors there if they came looking for the famous pair. "I got a call from a manufacturer in Singapore," Thomas said, stirring his coffee. "They want to mass-produce the filtration system. If it works out, we could reach millions of people." Rose beamed with pride. "That's incredible, Thomas. And I have you to thank for it," he replied, his eyes sincere. Rose shook her head. "You designed the system. You did the work. But I might have given up without you," Thomas insisted. "That's what people don't understand about homelessness. It's not just about lacking shelter, it's about lacking hope. A comfortable silence fell between them. Through the window, they could see the bookstore where Thomas had once sought refuge from the rain. It had been renovated recently, its facade brightened with fresh paint and new signage. "I've been thinking," Rose said finally. "The foundation is growing faster than I expected. We could help more people if we expanded our reach." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "What are you proposing?" "A partnership," Rose explained. "Between your company and the Visible Fund. We could establish a program that provides job training in environmental engineering for people trying to rebuild their lives." Thomas's face lit up at the idea. People who've experienced hardship often develop unique problem-solving skills. They could bring valuable perspectives to the field. As they discussed the details, a new customer entered the diner. The woman looked tired, her clothes worn but clean, her eyes bearing the unmistakable weariness of someone carrying too many burdens. Rose and Thomas exchanged glances. Without a word, they understood each other perfectly. Thomas signaled to the server, quietly arranging to pay for the woman's meal. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wouldn't change the woman's life overnight. But they both knew from experience that sometimes, all it takes is one moment of kindness to plant the seed of possibility. The woman Thomas and Rose had noticed turned out to be named Anna. A single mother of two, she had recently lost her job at the factory when it downsized. Too proud to apply for assistance right away, she had been stretching her savings to the breaking point. When the server told her that her meal had been paid for, Anna looked up, confused and slightly embarrassed. Rose approached her table with a warm smile. "I hope you don't mind," she said, sliding into the booth across from Anna. "I'm Rose." Anna's initial defensiveness softened as Rose spoke to her. There was no pity in Rose's eyes, only genuine interest. By the end of their conversation, Anna had agreed to submit an application to the Visible Fund. "It's not charity," Rose explained. "It's community." 2 weeks later, Anna became the newest recipient of a Visible Fund grant. The money allowed her to enroll in a certification program for medical coding, a skill that would lead to stable employment with flexible hours, perfect for a single parent. As word of the Visible Fund spread, local businesses began to take notice. The owner of a construction company offered to provide apprenticeships. The community college developed a scholarship program specifically for fund recipients. What had started as a simple act of kindness between Rose and Thomas was evolving into a community-wide movement. Thomas's business continued to grow as well. The deal with the Singapore manufacturer went through, and his water filtration systems were being implemented in communities across Southeast Asia. He traveled frequently now, but always returned to Riverdale, always made time to visit the diner and check in on the foundation's progress. On a bright spring morning, almost 2 years after Thomas had sat huddled under the bookstore awning, he and Rose stood before a small crowd gathered for the official opening of the Visible Center. Located in a previously abandoned building downtown, the center would serve as a hub for the Visible Fund's expanding programs, offering workspace, classes, counseling services, and more. "When I was at my lowest point," Thomas said during his speech, "I became invisible to most people. But all it took was one person who truly saw me to change everything." He looked at Rose, who stood quietly to the side, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Sometimes we look for massive solutions to society's problems," Thomas continued. "But what I've learned, what Rose taught me, is that transformation often begins with the smallest actions. A meal shared. A conversation. A moment of genuine connection." As he spoke, Rose noticed Anna in the crowd, standing tall and confident, her children beside her. Next to them was the former teacher who had received the first grant, now mentoring others. Throughout the audience were faces of people whose lives had been touched by the ripple effect that began that rainy day at the diner. When it was Rose's turn to speak, she stepped up to the microphone with characteristic humility. "I never set out to start a movement," she said simply. "I just couldn't stand by when someone needed help. That's not special, it's human. And I believe that same capacity for compassion exists in all of us." After the opening ceremony of the Visible Center, Rose found herself busier than ever. The foundation's success had attracted attention from neighboring cities, with community leaders reaching out to learn how they might implement similar programs. What had begun as a local initiative was slowly expanding its reach. Thomas, meanwhile, received an offer that would test his commitment to Riverdale. A major international corporation wanted to acquire his filtration technology, a deal that would require him to relocate to their headquarters in Chicago. The money was substantial, but more importantly, it would mean his invention could reach even more people in need of clean water. "I don't know what to do," he admitted to Rose one evening as they sat on a bench overlooking the town square. "This could be everything I've worked for." Rose was quiet for a moment, watching children play on the newly installed playground equipment, another community improvement that had sprung from the revitalization sparked by their efforts. "Remember when you were designing the filtration system?" she finally asked. "You told me you were obsessed with efficiency, making the biggest impact with limited resources." Thomas nodded slowly. "Maybe this is like that," Rose continued. "Sometimes the most efficient path isn't the most obvious one." The next day, Thomas called the corporation with a counteroffer. He would license his technology to them but remain based in Riverdale, where he would continue his research and development work. To his surprise, they agreed, seeing the value in keeping the inventor connected to his roots and the story that had already generated positive publicity. With this new arrangement secured, Thomas invested part of his licensing fee into the Visible Center, funding an innovation lab where people rebuilding their lives could develop their own ideas and inventions. The first project to emerge from this lab was a simple solar-powered device that could charge cell phones, crucial technology for job seekers who needed to remain connected but couldn't always afford electricity. One afternoon, as autumn leaves swirled around the town square, Rose received a letter from a woman in a city nearly 200 miles away. The woman explained that she had read about the Visible Fund online and had been inspired to start something similar in her own community. "You've started a chain reaction," Thomas said when Rose showed him the letter. "That's how real change happens, not all at once, but person by person, community by community." As they celebrated the second anniversary of their first meeting, Rose and Thomas sat at their usual booth in the diner. Mr. Chen, who now served on the board of the Visible Fund, brought them coffee himself. "You know," Rose said, watching raindrops trace patterns on the window, "my mother used to tell me that everyone has a purpose. I always thought mine was small, just to be kind where I could. I never imagined it could lead to all this." Thomas smiled. "Maybe that's exactly the point. We never know how far a small act of kindness might reach." Outside the diner, a young woman hurried past, seeking shelter from the rain. She paused under the awning of the bookstore across the street, the very spot where Thomas had once sat. From their booth, Rose and Thomas watched as one of the bookstore employees stepped outside, offering her an umbrella. 3 years after their first meeting, Riverdale had transformed in ways few could have predicted. Downtown storefronts that had once stood empty now housed small businesses, many started by recipients of the Visible Fund. The old community center had been renovated and expanded, offering programs for everyone from children to seniors. There was a new energy in the town, a sense of possibility that hadn't existed before. One Tuesday morning, Rose received a phone call that left her momentarily speechless. It was from the governor's office, informing her that she and Thomas had been selected to receive the state's highest civilian honor for their community work. The ceremony would take place at the state capitol in 1 month. "They want us to give a speech," Rose told Thomas when she called him with the news. "I'm not sure I can do that." "Of course you can," Thomas assured her. "Just tell the story the way you live it, one person at a time." As preparations for the ceremony began, a documentary filmmaker reached out, asking permission to create a short film about the Visible Fund. Initially hesitant about the attention, Rose eventually agreed when she realized the film could inspire others to start similar initiatives. The filmmaker spent weeks following Rose and Thomas, capturing the daily operations of the Visible Center and interviewing people whose lives had been changed by their work. Anna, now a certified medical coder working from home, spoke eloquently about how the fund had helped her maintain her dignity while rebuilding her life. The beauty of what Rose and Thomas created, Anna explained to the camera, is that it recognizes that people don't just need resources, they need to feel valued. The Visible Fund doesn't just give handouts, it invests in potential. The night before the award ceremony, Rose couldn't sleep. She stood by the window of her hotel room in the state capital, looking out at the lights of the city and thinking about how far she had come from her days of just scraping by. A knock at her door revealed Thomas, also unable to sleep. "I've been thinking about that first bowl of soup," he said as they sat in the hotel lobby, the only guests awake at such a late hour. "How close I came to refusing it out of pride." Rose smiled at the memory. "And I almost didn't bring it out of fear of getting in trouble with Mr. Chen." "Small moments," Thomas mused. "That's what it all comes down to, isn't it? Small choices that we make every day." The ceremony the next day was grander than anything Rose had imagined. Government officials, business leaders, and community organizers from across the state filled the auditorium. When it was time for her speech, Rose approached the microphone with the same quiet confidence she brought to everything. "I'm often asked what motivated me to help Thomas that rainy day," she began. "The truth is simple, I saw someone who needed help, and I had the ability to offer it. That's not extraordinary, it's what humans are meant to do for one another." She paused, looking out at the audience. "The real miracle isn't what I did for Thomas, or even what he did for me in return. It's what happened when we decided that everyone deserves to be seen, really seen, for their inherent worth and potential." After the award ceremony, requests for Rose and Thomas to speak at events around the country began pouring in. Community organizations, business conferences, and universities all wanted to hear their story firsthand. The documentary about the Visible Fund had premiered at a small film festival and was generating significant buzz online. For Rose, who had once been content to remain in the background, this new public role was challenging. But she recognized that sharing their experience could inspire others to take action in their own communities. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this," she confided to Thomas as they waited backstage before a speaking engagement at a national conference on community development. "Sometimes I still feel like that waitress just trying to get through the day." Thomas smiled. "That's because at heart, you still are that person. The one who sees a need and responds without overthinking it. That's your superpower, Rose." The audience that day included leaders from cities across the country, all eager to learn how a small-town waitress and a once homeless engineer had sparked such meaningful change. As Rose and Thomas shared their story, they emphasized that the model could be adapted to fit any community. "The key is believing in people's potential," Thomas explained. "Not seeing them as problems to be solved, but as individuals with unique gifts to offer." When they returned to Riverdale, they found their community had continued evolving in their absence. The Visible Center was now offering a mentorship program pairing local professionals with fund recipients. A nearby community college had established a scholarship specifically for individuals rebuilding their lives after hardship. 5 years after that rainy day when Rose had first offered Thomas a bowl of soup, they stood together at the grand opening of Visible Village, an innovative housing community designed specifically for people transitioning out of homelessness. Unlike traditional shelters, the village offered private tiny homes clustered around shared spaces designed to foster community. The problem with most homeless services, Thomas explained to visitors touring the facility, is that they focus only on immediate needs without addressing the isolation that often accompanies hardship. Here, residents have both privacy and community. The village had been funded through a unique partnership between Thomas's company, the Visible Fund, and several businesses that had come to see the value in supporting community resilience. Each tiny home bore a plaque with the name of its sponsor, many of them local businesses that had once been reluctant to engage with the issue of homelessness. As Rose walked through the village, she stopped to chat with the first residents who were moving in. One elderly man, carrying a small bag containing everything he owned, looked around in disbelief at his new home. "I never thought I'd have a place of my own again," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I'd given up hope." Rose squeezed his hand gently. "That's why we named it Visible Village," she told him. "Because everyone deserves to be seen, even when they feel invisible." Later that evening, as the sun set over the village, Rose and Thomas sat on a bench overlooking the community garden that residents would tend together. On the 7th anniversary of their first meeting, Rose and Thomas decided to host a celebration at the original diner where it all began. The old building had been renovated, but Mr. Chen had insisted on preserving the booth where Rose and Thomas had shared so many conversations. The diner was packed with people whose lives had been touched by the Visible Fund and its various initiatives. Anna was there with her children, now teenagers. She had recently been promoted to a management position at the healthcare company where she worked. The former teacher who had received the first grant now ran her own successful tutoring center, employing several other fund recipients. "I never imagined one bowl of soup could lead to all this," Rose said as she looked around the crowded diner. Thomas laughed. "I think it was the coffee that really made the difference. The soup was a bit watery." Their playful banter was interrupted by the arrival of a special guest, the mayor of a large city 3 states away. She had implemented a program based on the Visible Fund model and had traveled to meet Rose and Thomas in person. "What you've created here isn't just changing Riverdale," the mayor told them. "It's becoming a blueprint for communities everywhere." The success of Visible Village had led to plans for similar developments in 5 other cities. Thomas's water filtration systems were now being used in communities across 3 continents. The documentary about their work had won several awards and was being used as a teaching tool in social work programs at universities. Yet despite their growing influence, Rose and Thomas remained grounded in the day-to-day work of seeing and supporting individuals. Rose still personally reviewed applications to the fund, and Thomas continued mentoring inventors at the Innovation Lab. The danger of growth, Thomas often reminded their team, is losing sight of the individuals behind the statistics. As the celebration continued, a young reporter approached Rose for an interview. "After all you've accomplished," she asked, "what are you most proud of?" Rose thought for a moment. "I'm proud that we've helped change the conversation about homelessness and hardship," she replied. "But what means the most to me are the individual stories, the mother who can now support her family, the inventor who got a second chance, the artist who found her voice again." Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, Rose and Thomas slipped away for a quiet moment. They walked to the spot across the street where Thomas had once sat with his notebook, trying to hold on to hope. "Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed," Thomas said. Rose nodded. "And yet, the simplest thing remains the most powerful, just seeing each other as we truly are." A light rain began to fall, reminding them of that day 7 years ago. But instead of seeking shelter, they continued their walk through the town that had been transformed by their friendship. In the window of a nearby shop, a sign caught Rose's eye. It featured the logo of the Visible Fund and the words that had become their unofficial motto, "Everyone deserves to be seen." Behind them, the lights of Visible Village glowed warmly in the distance, offering not just shelter, but a sense of belonging to those who had once felt forgotten. 10 years after that fateful rainy day, Rose stood at the podium of a national conference on community resilience. The audience before her included community leaders, business executives, and government officials from across the country. Behind her, a large screen displayed the now familiar logo of the Visible Network, the expanded organization that had grown from the Visible Fund. "A decade ago," Rose began, "I was a waitress just trying to make ends meet. I had no grand plan to change the world. I simply saw another human being in need and did what I could in that moment." She gestured to Thomas, who sat in the front row. "What we've learned over these 10 years is that transformation doesn't require extraordinary resources or special talents. It requires only the willingness to truly see one another and to believe in each other's potential." As she spoke, images flashed on the screen behind her, visible villages that had been established in 12 cities, innovation labs that had produced technologies addressing various community needs, and faces of countless individuals whose lives had been changed. The visible network now included partnerships with universities, businesses, and government agencies. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had evolved into a movement changing how communities approached issues of homelessness, poverty, and human potential. After the conference, Rose and Thomas returned to Riverdale. Despite opportunities to relocate to larger cities, they had chosen to remain in the town where their story began. Their work now took them around the world, but Riverdale remained home, a living example of what was possible when a community embraced the vision of seeing and supporting every member. On a quiet Sunday morning, Rose found herself back at the diner, sitting in the same booth where she had once brought soup to a stranger. She was early for her meeting with Thomas, a ritual they maintained despite their busy schedules. Looking around, she noticed a young server speaking with an older woman who appeared distressed. The server slipped away and returned moments later with a free meal and a kind word. Thomas arrived to find Rose with tears in her eyes. "What is it?" he asked, sliding into the booth across from her. "It's still happening," she said softly, nodding toward the server and the woman. "The ripples keep spreading." Thomas followed her gaze and smiled in understanding. "That's how real change works," he said. "Not from the top down, but from person to person." Later that day, they walked through the expanded visible village. What had begun as a cluster of tiny homes now included community gardens, a small business incubator, and a learning center. Children played in the common area while residents of all ages worked together on various projects. As sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues, Rose and Thomas sat on their favorite bench overlooking the community they had helped build. "Did you ever imagine it would become all this?" Rose asked. Thomas shook his head. "Never. But that's the beautiful thing about kindness, it has a power all its own, if we just give it room to grow." A young child approached them, offering wildflowers picked from the community garden. Behind her, parents and neighbors gathered for the weekly community dinner, a tradition that had become the heart of Visible Village. "The real miracle," Rose said as they joined the gathering, "isn't what we've built. It's that others are building it with us, each in their own way." And as the community shared their meal under the evening sky, the simple truth that had started it all remained at the center: everyone deserves to be seen.